3 weeks ago this morning, North Korea detonated its fourth nuclear device. Sometime between February 8th and February 25th, it will test a long-range ballistic missile. And this, I think, wasn't a total surprise to people. Maybe the timing was, but we're back into what has been a very complicated issue. And the views of North Korea's immediate neighbors is and remains a very important variable. I mean, if the North Korea issue were an automobile, Japan and South Korea, along with the United States, would be the feet on the accelerator, and China would be the foot on the brake. And that is being played out now. Whether the situation is going to be significantly different this time is an open question. So I'm Richard Bush, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you here today. This program is sponsored by our Center for East Asia Policy Studies, which I direct, and our John L. Thornton China Center, which my friend and colleague Chung Lee directs. And we have three great specialists to discuss these issues from the perspective of three different capitals. Jonathan Pollock will talk about China's response. Our good friend Sheila Smith will talk about Japan, and Kathy Moon will talk about the Republic of Korea. They will each talk for 10 to 12 minutes. I may have some questions for you, and then we'll open it up. So thank you again for coming. Jonathan.
Thank you, Richard. Actually, a modest correction. This is actually 4 weeks since the nuclear test.
Okay. Sorry.
And North Korea's sense of timing, of course, is that 4 weeks to the day, if not to the hour, of the nuclear test, North Korea disclosed its plans for another missile launch, satellite launch.
Sorry, another correction. It's January 6th, so we're short 2 days, I think.
No. It was on a Wednesday. Actually, Richard, what we missed, the only regret of this event, and I'm really delighted that we're having it, is we've selected the wrong day. It should have been yesterday. That was Groundhog Day, because we've all been here before. The question is whether this time around things look at all different. It's my own belief, and I tried to suggest in a blog post that I put on the Brookings website yesterday, that we are seeing, I think, tangible changes in the tone and substance of U.S. policy, captured most vividly by Secretary of State Kerry's visit to Beijing. His words were very, very strong, and with a clear implication that we will see actions that the United States has not been prepared to take before. But the question we're asking here is whether we see any comparable kinds of adjustments on the part of any of these three key regional actors, and what might the implications be vis-a-vis Pyongyang's estimate, if there is indeed an estimate, about the possibility of any kind of more coordinated strategy among the three. So my task is China. And I'm going to pose a couple of questions at the outset, and we can go from there. Has North Korea's latest test and the anticipated missile test changed in any measurable way what we can discern in the way of Chinese policy responses or Chinese behavior vis-a-vis the North? And the short answer is no. There seems to be a very formulaic presentation made by Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and presumably reflected in other kinds of statements coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that reiterate China's seemingly its long-held stance. The curious aspect of this is that as early as 2013, very early in Xi Jinping's tenure, he was in his comments taking a much sharper and harsher tone towards the North. I don't think it was obscure, and he has seemingly pulled back from that, and maybe we can speculate as to why. So the question to ask is, if there is Chinese policy change, why have we not seen it yet? The sense of silence from China on this issue is really quite extraordinary. Xi Jinping, other than his meeting with Secretary Kerry, to my knowledge, has talked to no other foreign policymaker, no other foreign leader. President Obama has even spoken to Vladimir Putin about the North Korean nuclear test. Nothing with radio silence, if you will, vis-a-vis the United States. Even more tellingly, Xi Jinping has chosen not to communicate in any meaningful fashion with the government of the Republic of Korea or with President Park Geun-hye, who he has closely cultivated over a period of time. Richard and I were both just in South Korea last week, and it is clear that China is paying a price for its silence, equivocation, whatever you want to call it, vis-a-vis this evolving relationship with South Korea. I don't want to call it an irreparable break, but it's something tangible. So the question then is, at the same time, has the test affected in any meaningful way China's overt or under-the-table willingness to cooperate with others to address this evolving challenge from North Korea? And the answer, again, is no, at least in the stated words. Now, very frankly, all states can do things unilaterally in a variety of ways. They can do things quietly. But there's nothing in China's observable language, body language, or actual words that, thus far at least, imparts a different quality. It will be interesting to see whether or not the satellite launch triggers a larger response in contrast to the nuclear test, although again, you would have to wonder why the nuclear test has not prompted a more forceful kind of Chinese statement. It's telling in this regard that the statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs is vastly harsher than what China has put forward, including on the missile test. So the question that I have to ask in my limited time remaining is, are there deeper anxieties or concerns on the part of China that are being a bit masked in this overall circumstance? Here again, I think in some significant measure, China is flying as blind as everybody else with respect to decision-making in Pyongyang. The Chinese do not, so far as I am aware, have any kind of high-level channels into the north. There have been leaders who have played that role in the past. One recently deceased in an automobile accident, the other conveniently executed by his nephew about 3 years ago. So there isn't really a channel here, even though you've got this very, very long border and you've got core interests that China has. So what are these deeper anxieties? A lot of these are very, very familiar. We've heard them before. They go well beyond the nuclear issue. An understandable concern would be over an acute crisis on China's border that could in various ways spill over into China. It's not something that China would seemingly welcome, so it may give China, even under the circumstances of North Korea's continued nuclear defiance, to, in some measure, play for time, minimize the risks, rather than confront the bigger realities that are faced. This could include, of course, in some characterizations, a major refugee crisis and the like, if there were some kind of a breakdown of authority in the North. How high are the odds on that? Very frankly, North Korea, I jokingly like to say when I wake up in the morning and I turn my computer on, they're still there. If there is upheaval within the North, I haven't seen it. There could be a lot of churn of one kind or another, but it's not observable to those of us on the outside. But there are concerns that go beyond that. Longer-term worries, some would argue that the implications if Korea were to unify, that this would find a unified Korean peninsula closely aligned with the United States, and posing a threat to China under circumstances where China's relationship with the United States seems so problematic. I know we like to credit China often with long-term thinking, But that's too far ahead to me. That the more immediate implications are whether or not, as a consequence of North Korea's actions, the United States, in collaboration with the ROK and prospectively with Japan, undertakes strategic activities, security activities in Northeast Asia that impinge on China, even if they are not intended to address China, and that this leaves China much more anxious. It wants to avoid that kind of a possibility. You would think, in that context, that the Chinese might want to step back and ask, well, gee, if we're really, really worried, rightly or wrongly, about the implications of heightened missile defense at higher U.S. exercise levels, of reinforcements of American forces on the peninsula and in the region, you would think China might want to give a little thought to what are the things that can be done to forestall these possibilities. They have not been evident. And it really does come back, I think, in some ways to China's inability to think beyond the immediate circumstances and to really game out where all these possibilities may lead over time. So what does this all imply about North Korea and North Korean calculations? North Korea seems on a timetable of its own. That's nothing new. They seem impervious to the entreaties and warnings of others. I might say in this context that in the fall, I think China believed it had North Korea in something of a box. That is to say, China had warned in September very strongly of the implications of another missile test that North Korea was clearly planning in September. North Korea did not test. And of course, North Korea faces its first party Congress in 36 years to be held in May, if it comes off without a hitch. And it may be that China believed or calculated, or at least some in China believed, that there was this window in time where you might be able to move more ahead, or at least get North Korea not to do things that would be overt challenges to existing circumstances. Not for the first time, and I fear not for the last, the Chinese miscalculated and they misestimated. So if there is a belief in some circles in the United States that China has a great deal of influence and sway over North Korean decision-making, it's news to me. What China does have, however, is not only its immediate presence, but its deep economic involvement in the North, and a belief in the United States, and maybe we'll come back to this and elsewhere, that if China so chose, it could impose costs on North Korea that would compel North Korea to think much more seriously about how it looks at these issues, and much more challenging to extant norms and beliefs. So here we are, we're stuck yet again, and we have to ask what can change the nature of this debate, and is it possible for a serious strategic conversation between the United States and China that has yet to occur, but urgently, in my view, needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks. Great start. Sheila?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for having me here. I'm delighted to be part of the conversation. I'll pick up a little bit on the Japan side where I think Jonathan left off. Let me start first by talking about Japan's response to the nuclear test. As you know, it's largely diplomatic for the Japanese, right? The immediate response is to talk to the United States and through the United States to Seoul. So the coordination there was immediate, and information sharing between the Japanese, South Koreans, and the U.S. Analysts was a primary tool for analyzing what was happening and how Japan ought to respond. The non-proliferation conversation, of course, is in the United Nations Security Council, and Japan is a non-permanent member. It's sitting in the Council deliberations, which is helpful for Tokyo, and it makes, for the United States, it gives the United States a very proactive partner in that conversation. That being said, of course, the conversation between Tokyo and China has not been what it should be, frankly. And given, this is I don't know which number of iteration we want to call this in terms of the diplomacy regarding North Korean provocations, but China has always been one of the phones that the Japanese pick up. And whether it was in the six-party framework for the regional security conversation, or it was just in the bilateral context. That conversation is muted at best, and I don't have any evidence that there's direct dialogue today. So the silence, Jonathan, you were referring to in Beijing or from Beijing, I think is a silence for Tokyo as well, to my knowledge anyway. As you know, in 2006, for the first time, then Prime Minister Abe imposed sanctions on North Korea for the first time. It was the first overt unilateral use of sanctions for behavior that Japan did not approve of. And those sanctions were lifted a couple of years ago when Japan and Pyongyang began a renewed conversation about reinvestigating the fate of Japanese who were missing in the north, both the abductees, who are clearly identified as having been abducted by North Korean agents, and also hundreds of missing persons cases that the Japanese police have gathered over the years that there's circumstantial evidence that they might be associated with some kind of North Korean behavior. So that conversation that Pyongyang instigated with the Abe cabinet then led to this kind of relaxation of the sanctions that had been ongoing. Those are token sanctions largely. I don't want to underestimate their importance in the diplomatic conversation here, but they are things like ship visits, port calls, approval for North Korean visits to Tokyo and vice versa, right? They're also a much closer monitoring of remittances from Japan by the financial officials in Tokyo. So those sanctions had been lifted in the hopes that the reinvestigation of the Japanese missing in the north could actually prove to be fruitful. It has not been. So the Japanese government has announced that it's willing to unilaterally reimpose sanctions or apply new kinds of sanctions unilaterally outside the framework of the UN. So that's where that conversation is on the nuclear test. There's a security concern, of course, in Tokyo, and especially now that the North Koreans have announced that they're going to have this new missile launch. You saw 4 or 5 days ago, the Minister of Defense, Mr. Nakatani, announced that the Japanese self-defense forces were on alert in case of a launch. This is very similar to 2012. It's simply Japan has put its air, in particular, air self-defense force and maritime self-defense force forces on alert so that they will have their ballistic missile defense systems in operation at the time of launch, whenever that launch takes place. You're probably aware that the Maritime Self-Defense Force is the major platform for Japanese ballistic missile defense, so sea-based ballistic missile defense. You've also seen pictures coming out of Tokyo, I'm sure, of the Ministry of Defense and other military installations of Japan activating their point defense systems, their PAC-3s, right? So they are on defense, the highest alert in case of a missile launch by the North. I think it's always useful to remind people that we're talking about a Western launch from North Korea, right? So the launch trajectory is over the East China Sea, which, as you know, is increasingly occupied by a variety of military and other kinds of maritime forces. It's a particularly busy space, so expect all forces in the region to be on pretty high awareness of the interactions, not only between North Korean missiles, but also between, obviously, the Chinese and Japanese maritime forces. So that's the military response. It's fairly consistent with what the Japanese did last time. Minister Nakatani was very clear to say that this is only to be used in the case that debris from either a failed launch or a mistaken, some kind of accident would bring debris into Japanese airspace. So I think the bigger questions are the questions that Jonathan was raising, really about what this says for the future. What does it say about Japanese strategic thinking, and also what it says for the alliance? Very clearly, the Japanese have been having a fairly complex conversation with the United States about the extended deterrent the United States offers to Tokyo. For a long time, Cold War, and for many years after the Cold War ended, Japan was relatively passive in this conversation about how the United States provided an extended deterrent and what kind of extended deterrent would satisfy Japanese security concerns. So that's a bilateral conversation that's been going on now for several years. I think that that's a conversation, we're not privy to the details of that, but I think you're seeing the Japanese play a much more active role in shaping American thinking about extended deterrent structures in Northeast Asia, both in the bilateral alliance and more broadly. So clearly, the acquisition or an improvement of North Korean nuclear capability potentially the miniaturization of a nuclear warhead. If we have a consistent demonstration of success in an intermediate range ballistic missile, this will clearly raise the threshold, I think, for Tokyo in thinking about what needs to happen in terms of extended deterrence. The second piece, but related, of course, is Japan's own conversation about its own defenses. To date, the Japanese have deployed systems that are largely what they call passive in nature, so ballistic missile defense systems, not an active defense system. In other words, not long-range cruise missiles or regional capability. That question is under consideration and under study in Tokyo. I don't think we should be surprised if it becomes a little bit more obvious that the Japanese may want to move in the direction, let's say, of a jointly managed platform that would allow them to respond, or them and us, to respond to missile testing by North Korea. And then finally, the longer-term question is this question of the alliances, the virtual alliances, or not so virtual at the moment alliances. I'm not sure what the right language is, but clearly the integration of the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-ROK alliance in terms of dealing with a peninsular situation, incident, blow up, whatever the right phrase here is really critical for U.S. policymakers. That we need to push the conversation a little further on how we integrate our ability to respond collectively with Seoul, Tokyo, and the United States should the North continue to move in the direction of a demonstrated capability that would challenge extended deterrence in Northeast Asia. And so I think for Tokyo as well, there is a hope that there will be greater information sharing with Seoul, maybe directly. Right now they share information via the United States independently with the United States, and then the United States shares with each partner. But I think there's a desire to move that conversation with Seoul forward. I don't know yet how, and Kathy will probably help us understand, how the missile defense conversation in South Korea is proceeding. But ultimately, of course, missile defenses in Japan and missile defenses in South Korea will need to speak to each other, at least, if not be interoperable. So there's some serious questions, I think, as North Korea proceeds down this path. Jonathan was alluding to the fact that China needs to be aware of this. I think policymakers in the region are already quite cognizant of the fact that we're moving out of our comfort zone of currently existing efforts to deter aggression by the North. And pretty soon the alliances really do have to come to grips with the fact that they're going to have to deal with a very different Pyongyang if we allow it to go much further. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. Kathy?
Thank you very much. I am going to talk briefly about Seoul's position, responses, much of which you know, but also, and in doing that, I'd like to focus on some of the continuity in policy and some of the seeming changes. I can't say they're fully changes yet because they haven't occurred officially. But I would really like to focus on the larger issues about whether past efforts at trying to get cooperation from China, Japan, Russia, et cetera, the UN, whether these are really the right paths to take again and again and again. And for those of you who are not familiar with American pop culture, Jonathan's reference to the Groundhog's Day, it's a movie with Bill Murray. I mean, that is brilliant because in that movie, you wake up and it's the same day over and over and over. He wears the same thing. He eats the same thing. He does the same thing. And it really resonates with actually not Kim Jong-un or North Korea. North Korea is trying different things. I feel like we're the ones outside of North Korea responding with the same things. So we need to try different suits. We need to try eating different foods. We need to try to break out of this Groundhog's Day prison. And so I'd like to really push us to think about how we might do that. As far as Seoul's responses go, many of you know President Park and the military have taken very strong positions rhetorically as well as in terms of military posture to be ready for anything. And of course, we know that the South Koreans turned on the what they call propaganda, K-pop propaganda, tactics, weaponry, arsenal yet again. I actually watched some of this. I don't watch K-pop, but I watched this in
I'll admit it.
preparation. I really don't. I don't watch American pop either. I don't have time. I'd rather much listen to opera, but that's me. But I did watch, and the boy band Bang Bang, and I can't understand a darn thing, that they're saying. And I do wonder how much the North Koreans can understand when I can't even understand them. But nevertheless, it's catchy, it's interesting. So, and it has a certain place in, it's asymmetrical warfare in a different kind of sense. South Korea is a stronger military power, but using unconventional tools with which to try to subvert some of the legitimacy of the Kim Jong-un regime. And that is continuing. The North Koreans have increase their capacity to retaliate against propaganda by turning up their propaganda against the South Koreans. Yesterday, all over Twitter, you might have read about the balloons that were sent in by the North Koreans. They're now imitating the South Korean activists, the defector activists in particular, who send propaganda into the North. Well, the Northerners, the North Koreans, sent in big balloons filled with used toilet paper, right, with human feces or animal feces, I don't know, garbage, trash, gum wrappers, cigarette butts. So this is, we talk about dirty warfare in different terms in a strategic sense, but this is really getting disgusting on a crude level. So we have that kind of response on both sides. But the North Korean Ministry of Unification, the Blue House, they are sustaining trust politique, which to me is a little bit confusing. I think trust politique has been confusing from the start, but now it is truly becoming more confusing because the government says that it will maintain the basic principle of trust politique, but the focus will shift from dialogue and cooperation to firm response. The whole idea of trust politique was peaceful dialogue, negotiation, and reconciliation, acts toward reconciliation. And of course, we know it needs two to tango. One aspect of trust politique that we thought had promise was the family reunions that occurred after the August DMZ event. And of course, now that has fallen by the wayside. I think the Korean government needs to clarify, you either have trust politique or you don't. Right now does not seem a time for trust politique. And this is a time to really reassess what is not North Korea a la Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung, but what is North Korea a la, in terms of the leadership of Kim Jong-un, that culture up to. And I see it as very different from Kim Jong-il's time, his father's time. Trust politique might have been more effective during Kim Jong-il's regime. I don't think so under Kim Jong-un. The ROK has put, along with trust politique, which was to also let individuals and private groups try to meet and learn to get along, build trust. One aspect of that has been stopped. The ROK has put a temporary cease or halting of civilian exchanges and reduced the number of South Korean workers in Kaesong to the minimal amount. The latter part, I think, is a safe measure. I think that is a defensive, protective measure to protect South Korean citizens. However, I think that preventing South Koreans from going to international conferences that have to do with peace, that have to do with women's organizations, that have to do with environment, that have to do with development, education, I think that is not a good move. I think citizens should be permitted, South Korean citizens should be permitted as a free society to go, represent their interests as civil society members. If there are North Koreans, you deal with them in a way that seems appropriate in the context. But I think to prevent citizens, South Korean citizens, from going to conferences just because North Koreans would be there is not the right move. The South Korean government is continuing, of course, to support whatever the UN security sanctions will be. and lobbying hard for strong, what Park Geun-hye calls bone-numbing. It sounds weird in English, but in Korean, it's not a new term. I mean, I've heard this from my own family, you know. And I hurt my mother. I'm so bone-numbingly hurt by you. So it's not that dramatic, okay?
It sounds dramatic.
It sounds dramatic, but you know, in Korean language, it's like it's Korean drama, you know. But at any rate, it means that the government is serious. The South Korean government wants to see as tough a sanctions regime as possible, and then enforcement, of course. And then the ROK government itself will maintain its May 24th sanctions, which many thought might be negotiable in the last couple of years. There was talk, and now that will be frozen for some time. Also, in addition to these already existing policies and measures, there are some additional ones that have gained more traction since the testing of the alleged H-bomb. One is, it looks like the North Korea Human Rights Act or legislation regarding North Korean human rights will have a better chance of becoming passed in South Korea. This legislation has been held hostage by party politics, the left-right divide. It's been poisonous, and I think South Korea, in my opinion, should have had one a long time ago. But nevertheless, it looks like the moment is a better moment for this for bipartisan or multi-partisan at this point collaboration. But again, this is South Korean politics. It's volatile. It can change any day. I'm not making any promises. Two, of course, the missile defense, whether it's THAAD or whether it's the Korean indigenously made missile defense system, this has now become much more salient, not only in the defense sectors in South Korea, but also in the legislature and in civil society. I think regardless of China's resistance, South Korea is more willing to test the waters on this than ever before. And there is, the creation of a ROK nuclear arsenal is the other bit of information that we should keep in mind. Jung Mong-jun of Hyundai has been one of the proponents of this for some time, and now he has come out more forcefully, and he's actually been getting some party support, some of the leaders in Saenuri Party, et cetera, to consider South Korea having its own nuclear arsenal, and that might be an interesting topic for discussion. Let me just briefly talk about how we can expand this dialogue or at least a thought process, because in my view, I don't want to see another Groundhog's Day repeat itself, and the way we're headed, that's where we're headed. I don't see the U.S. position as really anything major in terms of changes. I don't think we have a policy change position, because we don't really have, in my opinion, a very clear policy about what to do with North Korea. Whatever we've been saying, it's not been working, and yet we won't admit that it's not working and move on to something different. When I look at what to do with North Korea, we need to consider the goal, the process, the effect. The goal of what to do with North Korea is unclear on the part of many of the six-party members. China, the US, South Korea are the farthest apart, and of course Japan in there with different interests in addition to the nuclear issue. Russia, unclear. Sometimes it says, we're going to come out tougher this time, and then I just read something that said that Russia, we are much more in line with China than people assume. So again, what are the different parties' goals, the party members' goals? If we don't have clear goals among the five parties, we're in trouble. Non-nuclear North Korea has been the mantra. It's what we say with our prayer beads. Please don't let North Korea continue to do this. But we all put up with its nuclear activities and acknowledge unofficially that it is a nuclear state. Okay, officially not, but we acknowledge. We act that way. All the countries involved. We had an opportunity at the end of the Clinton administration to change the future and avoid this current mess. But I won't go into the past. It's not worth it. The first nuclear test was under Mr. George W. Bush, and then the tests have continued in this administration. This emphasis that started with George Bush, focusing on China as the partner that should deliver, like a midwife delivering a newborn baby to the rest of the world, I believe has been wrong from the start. We never should have relied on China from the start. North Korea is never going to be a new baby delivered to us, all right? And if it were, it'd be more of a mess than it is now. With Kim Jong-il, we might have been able to negotiate a freezing or reduction for the long term, because I believe that Kim Jong-il had an understanding of nuclear weapons being tied to specific strategic and diplomatic goals. I don't think Kim Jong-un has that clarity of means and ends. I think Kim Jong-un wants nukes for the sake of nukes. I think he has drunk the Kool-Aid. This is another American metaphor, meaning back in the, was it 70s? Jim Jones was a religious cult leader who basically killed his followers. It's not that different from what North Korea is, by having them drink Kool-Aid laced with, I think it was cyanide, okay? So Kim Jong-un has drunk the Kool-Aid, his own people have drunk the Kool-Aid, that more nukes is more power, and more nukes equal staying in power. Bigger and faster is better in perpetuity. So this is a problem. As far as the process go, I know if I'm up at time, I'll just go very fast. As far as the process, wrong from the outset to rely on China. It's no longer the Sino-North Korean relationship at stake, but China's own interests are primary. Unless North Korea's actions threaten Chinese territory, its people's health, political stability, my belief is China will not act. And action by China will not mean that it can stop North Korea. It's not going to use military means, and even economic means has limits. North Korea will be ready to let its people suffer again, okay? North has also historically used China and challenged its big brother role while benefiting from it as well. So there's a lot of North Korean resentment there. It's not clear that the North will follow the Chinese, no matter how bad the so-called punishment is. As far as sanctions go, Kim Jong-un's regime will take all sorts of, quote, punishment. We've been using this word punishment, 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 as if this is a child that needs to be spanked. This is a gangster who doesn't care about spanking. He's out, ready to kill and be killed potentially, at least have his people be killed. So I don't look at punishment and leading to privation as a major incentive for North Korea to change its ways. As far as it's the people who support Kim Jong-un, deprive them of their luxury goods, so what? If they complain, they'll die. Their heads will roll. They're not going to complain. The most appropriate sanctions are to reduce the possibility of materials for the nuclear program that go into the North, but there are problems there because much of it leaks from the Chinese side. China has very poor export controls, even among its own people, let alone the stuff that goes into North Korea. China apparently also benefits from some of the parts that North Korea sends out. Germany has been sending China some high-tech equipment and parts for various things, which then has become siphoned off into North Korea. So this is not just a China-related issue. This is a multinational problem. My last bit here is that getting nations and others providing what I call plain but privileged consumer goods like Coca-Cola, which is imported from Italy, fruit juices from Malaysia, mining technology and know-how from Mongolia. These are all countries that the US, South Korea are friendly with. I think if we target the goods that the new rich in North Korea have become accustomed to, that may have more effect because they're not in cahoots with the very top of the Kim Jong-un's elite cohort. But these are people who are benefiting from the regime. If they don't see their daily benefits, they may react. So get normal Pyongyang people, not just top elites, to suffer a bit. One out-of-the-box consideration, remove North Korea from the United Nations. Kick them out. UN is a club. It has rules and norms like any other club. The North Korea has violated every kind, from the COI report to these to going against the Security Council resolutions. What's the point of keeping them there? I just throw that as provocateur.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll get back to many of Kathy's points during the Q&A. I would like to pose one narrower question for the panelists. I guess for Kathy and Sheila, to what extent did South Korean leaders and Japanese leaders publicly, after the nuclear test, sort of stress the role of China? And I emphasize the word publicly. And then for Jonathan, with that background, Secretary Kerry was very quick out of the box in emphasizing the role of China and its obligation to sort of get tough. Do you think that that was the proper way to actually elicit China's cooperation, sort of publicly essentially warning them? Or was there another way that would have been more effective? So let's start with Kathy and move down.
Well, I went over, so I'll give my share first to Sheila and fill in when I can.
So the Japan-China relationship, as you know, at the moment is in a restorative phase, let's put it that way.
Healing.
Healing, yes. We're trying to get back to normal, whatever that is now for the Japan-China relationship. And in a more serious note, I think that there have been not public, but private efforts to communicate. But to date, to my knowledge, they have not been successful. The Prime Minister Abe was very quick after the nuclear test. And then, as I said, Minister Nakatani very easily, after the announcement of the satellite launch schedule, they basically spoke out very fast. China was not in the text, right? Diplomats have been engaged, as far as I know, but again, not a political statement of pressure on China to act. I think the other place to look, of course, is in the UN Security Council, where the diplomats have been pushing quite hard. But I don't know that this moment, that an overt Japanese effort to out the Chinese or to push the Chinese out of the box of silence that Jonathan referred to, would be very effective or very helpful either to the Japan-China relationship. So I suspect there's more going on here than the specific response to North Korea. I will say it's been really interesting to me, and I know it's not part of your question, Richard, but it's also been very interesting to hear a lot of Japanese focus on Washington to help with our friends in Korea. So there's a residual kind of effect of the kind of last several years of deterioration in the Seoul-Tokyo relationship that we're also seeing, and on the quiet side of diplomacy as well.
Kathy? Do you...
I agree with everything Sheila said. Just two things that might be of interest. The South Koreans have been looking at their efforts at wooing China for a quick short-term return. And I think South Korea should separate its longer-term relationship with China from its immediate need for Chinese assistance or support. It is not a broken relationship because Xi Jinping did not answer the phone, or the defense minister in China did not answer the ROK defense minister's hotline. But just separate them, have a long-term view. There are a lot of other issues besides North Korea at stake between the Sino-South Korean relationship. The second is, people have wished that a five-party talk, including Park Geun-hye, would occur. I want to throw something else out there. You know what? If China doesn't want to join a five-party talk, have a four-party talk. Get the Russians on board, because the Russians have an interest in working with the U.S. to some extent, and if pit Russia against China for now. A South Korean academic or analyst in a South Korean paper wrote right after the H-bomb alleged test, that, oh, this is what the North Koreans always planned, to isolate China and to push the Japanese, South Koreans, the US together, and then this way the Chinese will have to stay with North Korea. And I think that's a very naive interpretation. The Chinese have no interest. They got nothing to gain by having North Korea as their main ally. But they could get a message. You don't work with us? We say this is urgent? Okay, we have no choice. We got to work on our urgent stuff. So have a four-party talk. Bring in the EU.
Jonathan?
Secretary Kerry's initial and very public statement, in my own view, was ill-advised. For one reason and one reason only, that if you, in a very overt, public way, engage in chastising allegations against China, it immediately flicks the switch of a very, very ritualistic response from China, that they will react in a way that guarantees that you make no headway. He's made a statement, however, when he was in Laos that I thought was much more constructive, which indicated that his intent was really to move toward confidential conversations with China, if possible. Make this a lower volume, and therefore a less scripted, if you will, process. Although his comments in Beijing in the press conference with Wang Yi were very, very forceful, that's a more appropriate context where two leading foreign policy officials are talking about their deeper concerns. It's very striking and I think heartening in a way that there was no statement of any way, shape, or form about the results of Secretary Kerry's meeting with Xi Jinping. Nothing, not a peep. And I know we live in this very media-driven age where the presumption is, at the end of any meeting, let's have a press rolled out, let's speculate about this, speculate about that. That doesn't get us anywhere. If we're going to make headway here, it's going to have to be through quiet, private conversation. Let me, if I could, Richard, inject two other considerations that we haven't really talked about. It seems to me when we talk about North Korea, we talk about two very different trajectories. One is whether or not this regime is sustainable over the longer haul, economically, politically, otherwise. I know the United States is very, very partial to arguments that, their end is at hand. I don't detect that kind of thinking, frankly, presently in the Obama administration, nor do I think that the adjustments, the changes in U.S. policy have that as a design in mind. It is much more to impose costs on North Korea for its pursuit of nuclear weapons and missiles, thereby hoping to inhibit its activities and the rate of progress. So that's one trajectory. The other trajectory, of course, is the rate at which they will materialize and mature a capability with respect to nuclear weapons and missiles. It's very striking here. I'm not one to lowball the risks, but North Korea does not test frequently, and the results are often rather problematic. North Korea may make elaborate claims for what it's achieved, but if those are not evident, let's not give them credit for what they haven't done. So in that respect, it's worthy of note that the nuclear tests seem to have come on a 3 to 4 year cycle. Missile tests, a little more frequently, but not all that often. Why? These things cost a great deal of money. They entail great preparations. North Korean resources are necessarily constrained. And although I know people think that the sanctions just haven't worked till now and they're very, very leaky, I'm not going to presume an answer to that. If you had no kind of an effort to constrain what goes in and what flows out, it could be they would be making more rapid progress. So maybe what Kim Jong-il wants to do is saying, look, we're going to ratchet this up. We're going to do these things more often. We've built up more impressive launch sites. If you saw a more rapid turnover in their testing program, would that elicit a different kind of response. One last thought I would just say in terms of consequences, it was implicit in a lot of things that I was saying, but if Xi Jinping believed over the last year or more that he could somehow wean the ROK from its close relationship with the United States and somehow move North Korea, or South Korea rather, to some kind of an in-between position. South Korea is in an in-between position, it can deal with both, but the latest events, the test itself, and China's silence, both publicly and privately, since there have been no private communications with the South Koreans, has strongly reaffirmed the US-ROK relationship. Koreans grasp the importance of this for their own interests, and so that's been one of the costs that I think China has paid for its equivocation or worse.
Finger?
Just sort of coming out of both Kathy's suggestions and Jonathan's comments is, we've always dealt with North Korea in the box of North Korea. And I think what we're all kind of talking about here is that we're now talking about a regional security environment that has drastically shifted.
Absolutely.
So not just that North Korea is acquiring this capability, but the bilaterals, both the channel of dialogue and the ways in which there's defense cooperation, those are also shifting. Right. So whether it's China and South Korea, whether it's Japan and South Korea, whether it's China and Japan, all these bilaterals are shifting in ways that I think we ought to recognize.
Absolutely.
So that geostrategic shift that we all reference for Asia, of course, it's ongoing. We can see the impact specifically on the management of the North Korea problem, I think, in ways that we didn't 3, 4, 8 years ago, right?
Okay, thank you. We now have a little over half an hour for questions. I will call on people. Once I call on you, wait for the microphone and identify yourself and identify to whom you're posing your question, if that's the case, and please keep your question short. Chris Nelson, I saw you first, down here in front. Mike's coming.
Thanks so much, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Great conversation. My question's for everybody, but I wanted to say I'm glad Jonathan used the Groundhog Day metaphor, because we all do that, but I'm really glad Kathy reminded us to explain that to not just the Asia side. And I would suggest it's actually, it's Buddhist. It's about reincarnation. The point of Groundhog Day was to keep going over and over and over your same stupid mistakes until, maybe if I change this or change that, I'll get the girl. And at the end of the movie, he did get the girl. So the relevance to North Korea, what's the girl there? I think we've convinced ourselves that it's not going to be denuclearization under the Kim regime. So if the Groundhog Day is an apt metaphor, that we have to keep trying something, late Steve Bosworth, bless his heart, said, if we don't know if we don't keep trying. What is the girl? Are we talking leap day? People tell me that actually Obama is considering trying to get what are we talking about as the prize in getting North Korea back to the table? What is realistic to be talking about?
Anybody?
Chris, I do want to say, actually, skip the Buddhist metaphor, it's biblical. And you recall in the movie that Bill Murray gets a little better each day. And ultimately he gets to his reward. I don't know. I think I'm reminded of Carl Sandburg's admonition that blessed are those who expect nothing, for they shall not be disappointed. I don't think.
Very uplifting.
Yeah, no, I know. I don't think that there are maximal expectations here. I would say if anyone has come close to defining a long-term objective, it probably has been China. The Chinese have, in essence, said that what they seek is a normal North Korea. Now, that may be a bridge too far. They want a normal relationship with North Korea. They want a North Korea that is not invested in this profoundly adversarial nationalism that has shaped this regime from its very origins and has persisted. Let's remember that China, I've often said this, but I'll repeat it again, China's record of convincing somehow cajoling, convincing, persuading North Korea to go about its life differently is a record that is unblemished by success over decades. That hasn't stopped the Chinese from trying, because I think that there is still an underlying belief in serious circles in Beijing that at the end of the day, the arrangement is simply not sustainable. I mean, at present, for example, the South Korean economy is roughly 35 times the size of the North Korean economy. Think about it. Will North Korea be content when it's 40 times, 50 times, 60 times? I mean, there's a sense in which this is kind of like the Stein rule, when something doesn't work, ultimately it has to end. But how you get there, again, I think the Chinese predominant judgment somehow is that at the end of the day, there will be some kind of an evolution, or needs to be some kind of an evolution to a more normal North Korea. Now, the calculation elsewhere may be different, even though I think that it would be, for all of us, it would be devoutly to be wished. It's just that the evidence runs so contrary to that, and that's what's so troubling. So a belief that this is not going to have a happy ending. We just don't know when and how that ending occurs. So I think for right now, it's one of just trying to minimize risk, control the possible risks, retain options in case things go from bad to worse, but trying by whatever means to impart to young Kim that there is a relationship between his behavior and the kind of relationship that will be possible vis-a-vis the outside world, if indeed he seeks that kind of a normal relationship with the outside world, which I think is open to question.
Other comments?
Just a quick comment, Chris. I think it's interesting that if you're sitting inside Washington and listening to our debate, I'm not talking about Tokyo's debate now, I'm just talking about our debate, I think the girl has changed. I think it used to be that we were focused on Pyongyang, that non-proliferation, that containment, deterrence, and those were the focal points. I think now it's changing Chinese behavior. I think we've gotten very fixated, not necessarily for good reasons, on how do we get Beijing to manage the problem differently. And so, the Groundhog Day metaphor may also include a little bit of, who and how are we trying to change things. I think we may be coming back, and I'm very interested to hear from others in the room who think about North Korea more specifically, but I think we may be coming back to defining that vision for the Korean Peninsula differently. Clearly, President Park has begun to introduce the unification model vision, right? The Human Rights Commission report began to raise consciousness a little bit about it's not just a denuclearized North that we want, it is a North that fundamentally is a different kind of society, right? So I think you're starting to hear, at least I'm hearing glimmers in the American conversation, that we don't use the regime change word very often as a policy goal, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's the only way that we envision the future. But I think the U.S. is beginning to have a different kind of conversation about what the long-term goal is. And it's no longer simply denuclearization, because there's a frustration that we haven't been able to affect that calculus in the North. But again, many girls in the room.
Can I just add, I'm a graduate of a women's college. I've taught at a women's college. I'd like to say, what's the woman?
Oh, there you go.
Not the girl.
Speaking of Hollywood cliché.
Yes. Don't worry. You take it so personally, Sam, Chris. I think for the United States, what is the end goal? What is the goal that we're after? And as Sheila's saying, it may be changing, but I think we need to think both small and big. Small in terms of incremental, because North Korea, no matter how much we might want it to be a, quote, normal state, it's going to take a long time to get there. Two, what does a normal state mean from where it is now? We need to think about that. And how do it is not going to go from what it is now to what we consider to be a normal state anytime soon, as I mentioned. But can we map out what are the stages of trying to help North Korea, and again, help is the wrong word probably, but induce or entice North Korea toward normalized statehood, et cetera. And there, I think we need to think about the U.S.'s role, but mostly the U.S.'s will. If you think, I just recently was writing about U.S.-Vietnam relations in normalizing and pre-normalizing. The U.S. had not only, the U.S. had business interests, it had different interest groups and congressional interests, including former veterans of the Vietnam War, John McCain being one of them, Hagel, Kerry. These were all key congressional players, actors on a national level who backed not only normalization, but pre-normalization reconciliation. And they helped in Congress to pass certain acts or bills that enabled the U.S. to grant Vietnam a privileged trade status prior to normalization. The problem is we don't have, in my view, genuine will either in the U.S. government or in the larger American society to bring North Korea into the pack. And I think until and unless we have that, we have to have that desire. You're assuming that Bill Murray, we know Bill Murray had a desire to get Andie MacDowell, the girl, the woman. We as a U.S., if we're Bill Murray doing the same thing every day trying to reach out, we don't have the desire to get North Korea.
Go to the woman in the very back, and then Gil Rosman, and then I'll go over here.
Good morning. Thank you for doing this. Pam Dawkins, State Department correspondent, Voice of America. Two quick questions. First of all, for Jonathan, is China, in essence, stonewalling when it comes to any strong response in the UN Security Council? And for Kathy, is it time for the United States to consider unilateral action?
Very, very quickly, my understanding is that that China has not provided any detailed comments on draft resolutions in the UNSC process. To some extent, that may be stalling for time. It's clear the Chinese know there will be a fourth resolution, a sanctions resolution. They've warned the North Koreans that would be forthcoming if their behavior warranted it. And you could argue that there's a negotiation there. My point is the concern would be if the ultimate content, in other words, what China is ultimately prepared to agree to, is a very diluted version, that's going to be a real sense that nothing really has changed. Now, that said, under the cover of a sanctions resolution, states, including the United States, but also including China, can take unilateral actions that reflect their judgment about their own interests and how to proceed. China could be a very, very key variable there that we don't know. So they haven't disclosed yet. And again, in a way, I'm not troubled by that. The fact that there's nothing public about it is probably just as well, because we're still in a negotiating process, but it cannot drag out indefinitely. It has to be resolved before too long. But one other speculation, and I would claim this idea as my own, but it's not. It comes from Chae Sang-hun in the New York Times in a conversation, email message we had yesterday. Maybe he thought that the reason North Korea is advocating the rollout now of the missile test is that we're going to get a twofer. If there are going to be resolutions against North Korea for its nuclear test, why not just combine them both? What the hell? Get it over and done with, and do two for the price of one. We'll see.
And I'm so glad to see you here, but could you clarify what you mean by, is it time for U.S. unilateral action? What kind of action?
Punitive action against North Korea for the January 6th test and possibly also this upcoming test.
Well, the U.S. is already has embarked on this. Congress, the Senate have voted, and there's no uncertainty that, or it is certain, I'll put it in the positive, that U.S. sanctions will be tightened, strengthened. But as far as, if anyone's thinking about unilateral military action, no, I believe that is not in order, and that it should, that, of course, the U.S. government might say everything's on the table, and that's obviously, governments need to do that, but I don't think we're there. That would create everything we're trying to do to get people behind our leadership. I think a unilateral military action would basically, dissolve that. And then we'd be left with the mess. And we don't want to be left with a North Korean mess pretty much to clean up on our own. And we can't do it on our own. But the sanctions regime, also, it will be tightened. The question is, how do you target it? And how do you enforce it in a targeted way? Because we know there will be leaks, right? Even if we get other countries to agree to sanctions. But which are the ones that will be most important to block? And of course, the ones that would provide materiel for continued or to input sources for the nuclear program. That should be, of course, target number one. But I do think we should think really creatively about who in North Korea, I don't mean common people needing, to eat to stay alive, but who in North Korea might feel this. And I look at the new rich in North Korea as a target group that we should do more research on, because they're not as loyal to the regime, and the regime is a little skeptical of them, but the regime needs them for the other side of Pyongyang, which is the economic reform and prosperity.
My sense, if I could intervene, is that the financial sanctions that we imposed on Iran probably provide a point of reference for both the executive branch and for the Congress. Moreover, with financial sanctions, the administration has the option of ensuring that they are done in both a primary way, sort of U.S. only, but also a secondary way, and forcing financial institutions in other countries, including China, to make a choice between dealing with North Korea and dealing with the United States. Are there other comments? Gil Rosman.
I'm the editor of the ASEAN Forum, and this is an issue of great interest to me for the last 15 years or so. And I think particularly Kathy's comment about Russia is missing a crucial point. We are on the verge of a new Cold War. Russia thinks that's the case around the world, and they want to use North Korea to help shape the outcome of that in Asia, Northeast Asia as elsewhere. And I think they believe China is on board with that, and they're very pleased with the way China and the U.S. are split on this. And it seems to me that increasingly we see that China is thinking of trade-offs. They don't like what's being done in the South China Sea by the United States. So my question is, if this is really the beginning of a Cold War with China and Russia lining up with North Korea in order to use it as a tool for altering the regional security system, what is the appropriate strategy apart from strengthening ties with our two allies?
I can give I didn't make the comments, I'll let Kathy talk about Russia, but I think there is a little nervousness in the region that Chinese behavior is not simply because Chinese interests are affected or because of the instrumentalities it brings to bear are different than the ones we would like to bring to bear. It is that the North Korea issue has now become quid pro quo, or at least a reaction. The way the Chinese are reacting to North Korea and our request for greater assistance on that is now becoming hostage to our behavior in the South China Sea. In other words, it's really tied to a U.S. PRC relationship, as opposed to what we had tried to tie it to, which was a non-proliferation regime and a development of a strong non-proliferation regime, which Beijing has deep interest in, right? I think, Richard's comment about the comparison between the Iran sanctioning regime and the North Korean one is an important one. It's, North Korea already has capabilities, whatever those capabilities may be. Iran did not yet. But the Iran regime was much more intrusive, and the instrumentalities that we brought to bear had much broader consensus across the board, and that China is not willing to do what many would like it to do, I think is an important indicator, but it's not just about the proliferation on the peninsula, I think. I think it's largely about the USPRC. I don't know, Gil, you have a better read on the Russians than I do, but I'm not sure that Putin's Russia is cozying up completely to, I'm not sure that their interests are the same in East Asia, frankly. And especially from Japan's point of view, they would really like to be able to make sure that they're not the same. And so there's a bilateral aspiration in there as well. But again, Kathy, I think the question on Russia was directed at you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Gil, I don't know I would see it, Troy. I mean, from a North Korean frame of reference, sure, they would love to have a new Cold War alignment, but that's a bridge too far for North Korea. I mean, they are simply not as nearly as consequential in that context. If I might quote from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs today, this is reactions to the announcement of the satellite launch. That North Korea is committing yet another violation of the UN Security Council requirements. North Korea shows provocative disregard for commonly accepted norms of international law. We call on North Korea to seriously think about the likely consequences of its frank confrontation with the international community to realistically evaluate the costs of such short-sighted steps. Now again, Russia may have a bigger investment in non-proliferation of all forms. That is an area where the United States collaborates quite actively with Russia. But here again, I think that the test is in part, the Chinese often accuse the United States and say, all your alliances are artifacts of the Cold War styles of thinking. Many in China are just as prone to that kind of thinking as anybody else. And if we both want to proceed down that path, well, so be it, but there has got to be a much more creative way if we, the Chinese and others, are going to build a sustainable international order for this very, very messy early 21st century. I don't think replicating the past, when in fact, whatever it may be, whatever this evolution of a relationship may be between the United States and China and Russia, it's not the Cold War. It's something very, very different from the Cold War for all the obvious reasons, because of globalization, communication, the kinds of interactions that we have. It's kind of a crutch almost. I'm not directing this at Gil, but to sort of believe that we're just going back to what we had before, highly adversarial relations, I don't buy it, unless we really, really screw it up. And we, I mean in a collective sense.
I echo Jonathan's points. I just want to add directly in response. I'm aware of Russia and China playing with each other and trying to look palsy vis-a-vis the United States, but by no means is this a tight partnership. It's not a marriage, let alone even a courtship. It's convenience. It's like an escort system. You need to go somewhere, you show up, you borrow each other. I do not believe. I mean, I'm so lucky that I have my director who is so calm and genteel. So I can add the punches, and we even each other out. And Jonathan and I, usually in private, we have a hoot laughing and talking about all sorts of crazy things. And Sheila knows me too well. But at any rate, Russia and China, no, we are not headed toward a second Cold War. And I think it's absurd for us to even entertain that possibility based on reality, not just that history might repeat itself. Russia and China realistically cannot prosper as a close-knit alliance vis-a-vis the United States, Japan, Europe, South Korea, et cetera. Economically, they cannot. Russia's already suffering big because China's need for its oil has been curtailed significantly. And China needs all of our markets, right? Russia is not China's dominant economic trade partner in consumer goods, manufacturers. China needs the rest of us, and we should keep that in mind and remind China, okay? And also, Russia and China compete with each other for influence, but also in terms of territorial influence, Central Asia is a direct area where they're in competition. North Korea is not a player, in my view, as you're saying. It's a pain in the neck for both of them. And what North Korea does is, we have to keep in mind, small actors have a big role in the way that big countries or big powers can shape their interests and actions. North Korea plays Russia and China off each other regularly. The North Koreans know that the Chinese have not delivered on the promises that they have made in the last 2-3 years of cozying up together. And one of the drivers in North Korea to cozy up to Russia is to reduce the dependence on China, which the North Koreans are very, very aware of. Right. So I don't think we're headed in that direction. And so I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it.
The gentleman on the aisle over there. Then I'll come to...
Hi, I'm Chen Weihua, China Daily. I have a question for Jonathan, if other panelists wants to jump in as well. I don't think we are in for a Cold War, but I just want to move a little further from the previous question. Jonathan, do you think this sort of a ratcheting up of the U.S. rhetoric of treating China as an adversary or potential adversary, as Ash Carter yesterday said in his 2017, budgetary preview, is sort of providing less incentive for China to do more than it should? The other, you already talked about, I really question, whether sanction will work. Why anyone would think sanction will work? This time, North Korea just announced today that it's going to test a satellite despite a U.S. threat of more sanctions. So that means King is not afraid of more sanctions. So why we shouldn't try as a sort of new path, say, assuring the North Koreans that U.S. will not pursue regime change like it removed Muammar Gaddafi after Gaddafi gave up its nukes? Thank you.
Chome, as always, you pose very, very good questions. Let me give you a very quick response. The first is that Ash Carter's statement, I think some of the headlines are misleading about that. He is, after all, the Secretary of Defense. He has those who play a counterpart role in China. Both countries are undertaking modernization strategies that, in terms of pure capabilities, may require an external justification to make more compelling the bureaucratic arguments that are made internally in both systems. And there's an interaction effect of that. I think that that's an easy temptation for the bureaucracies. I'm not sure that either country over the longer run will benefit. Other than that, there will be a lot more money spent. And I hope that that doesn't, the presumption is that will lead to an increased sense of security. I'm not so sure. But in any event, Ash Carter is far too careful and prudent a person to fall prey to, quick thinking that we're just going to use this to justify everything from soup to nuts. In fact, if anything, and when I looked at what he talked about, it was much more, a lot of it reinforcements in Europe, although there were some aspects of that do obviously involve China. It's a big issue worthy of a longer conversation. On the effectiveness of sanctions, I don't think anyone in the United States government believes that the mere imposition of heightened sanctions will, in some measure, automatically get North Korea to alter its behavior. But it is an intent to raise the costs to North Korea for the actions that it undertakes. The United States has repeatedly in the past, in periods of time when there has been active negotiation, given assurances about no regime change, other kinds of assurances. Either the North Koreans choose not to remember or it fell on deaf ears, but this has been true, I might add, through administrations, Republican and Democratic. of all shapes and sizes. There's a long history here. And I would say that if we have failed to prevent North Korea's development of nuclear and missile technology, it's a collective failure in which everyone has contributed, including China. So I don't think we're going to benefit if we make it too much of a blame game, nor can we reinvent past history. We have to say, what do we do now as we assess what the risks and the dangers might be, recognizing that it's a very, very difficult system to penetrate, to understand what is really driving their decision-making, because I think, frankly, a lot of that is driven internally. It's not a function of perceptions necessarily a threat. I mean, what does North Korea fear? North Korea fears information. It fears seepage of technologies, of all kinds of things that undermine this ability of the leadership of North Korea to control the way their citizens see the world, their understanding of the past, their prospects for the future. That's an issue well beyond this or that weapon system. It goes to the core of whether North Korea over the longer term can remain in not so splendid isolation from the world as a whole.
On the effectiveness of sanctions, it's worth keeping 3 words in mind: Banco Delta Asia. The gentleman on the aisle has had his hand up for a long time, in the black hat, and that'll be our last question.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I would like to ask the entire panel.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm Elliot Hurwitz. I'm a former State Department official, World Bank contractor, and intelligence community person. North Korea joins a list of countries that in the past have proliferated nuclear technology and or weapons. And I believe it was here at Brookings about 2 months ago that I heard that several countries in the Middle East, including Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are seeking nuclear technology, nuclear weapons. Can you please comment on the potential for North Korea to proliferate nuclear technology and or weapons? Thank you very much.
The immediate case, it's not even a potential, it's history. Under North Korean sponsorship and design, the Syrians were building a nuclear reactor, covert nuclear reactor. It was taken out by Israel in 2007, if I remember correctly. It was a carbon copy of North Korea's one functioning nuclear reactor. We have a number of photographs of North Korean personnel at this site. So this isn't a question of what might happen, it's a question of what did happen. Now that didn't mean that was an easy path to Syria acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, but it was one indication, and a troubling one, deeply, deeply troubling one, of once you have a competence in the scientific workforce, knowledge and understanding of designs and so forth, and a determination in an outside power to go down this path, North Korea can be a player in that regard. And, you know, one of the risk factors, I acknowledge this openly, if the screws really tighten on North Korea, under various circumstances, this may yet again be an option for them. And that's one of the things that all of us should be deeply, deeply worried about. Khan, that's where the...
Kind.
What's that?
He's one of a kind.
He was sui generis. Khan was a marketeer par excellence. He did it a lot for his own personal advantage rather than necessarily representing the state of Pakistan or anything else. Here, though, I would see an integral link between, if there were further activities of this sort, between the activities of component units in North Korea and the interests of the North Korean regime. But I am sure that the intelligence community pays very, very careful heed to this right now. They should.
Obviously, we could go on for quite some time because there's, I see from the number of hands, there's a lot of interest, but our stated time has come to an end. So thank you all for your great participation, and please join me in thanking our 3 panelists.